So thank you. Welcome today to this really important discussion. My name is Whitley Solmweber. I'm with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I run a program there called Project, and we're dedicated to understanding the intersections between challenges and national security. So I think this is an excellent place to be and an excellent place to have the conversation here at Coast Guard headquarters. I'm going to start off, just give a few remarks, and then I'll introduce my excellent panel today. And I think where we'll start is to comment just briefly around this idea that the world is obviously a dynamic place, but the nature of that dynamism is really changing. It's increasing in a number of fronts. It's increasing across the geopolitical realm, where we have emerging new great powers. It's increasing across the conflict realm, where we have new and emerging conflicts. Obviously, it's increasing across the health realm, where we have the COVID pandemic that is still ongoing across the globe. And it's also ongoing in the natural realm, where we have climate change accelerating as we speak. We're seeing that, of course, right now in California. We have the tremendous wildfires where we're actually seeing hazy skies here in D.C. But that's also playing out in the sea and in marine ecosystems, where marine ecosystems are being in dramatic ways. Species are moving northward, species are moving out of the traditional zones, and that's affecting the lives and livelihoods of people who rely on those species. So all these are combining into a way that is really changing the world from one where we've operated with an assumption of a steady state, or at least a world where it moves from steady state to steady state, a realignment of powers, of natural systems, of people into something new. But I think really, from my perspective anyway, the way the world's going is not a move into a steady state, but into one of continuous change. So for the foreseeable future, things are going to be dynamic. And how do we respond to that new, more dynamic? Really one of the questions that we're going to talk about here today. So back to the realm of the oceans for a minute. When we talk about threats When we talk about threats to marine resources, one of the most pernicious is something called IUU fishing, or illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Now, this is among the most vexing of the challenges. It's both a direct threat to marine resources by inhibiting sustainable management of those resources, but more broadly, especially when it's supported as a de facto state policy by many coastal states around the globe, it presents another significant crack in the already stressed infrastructure of global norms and collective governance that we have relied on for these past 75 years. Meeting these challenges requires us to forthrightly engage with the strategic implications of the IUU threat. It requires new global commitments to transparency and collective management on the high seas, to bring light to the shadows. It will require the U.S. to recognize and support the importance of this issue for many of our partners and allies, and that we assist in new ways with data sharing and enforcement. Lastly, it will require a strong response to those states that continue engaging in sometimes predatory behavior while disregarding global norms and responsible use of marine resources. So I'm so glad to be joined here today by several senior members of the U.S. national security establishment to discuss this issue and to highlight the release of a new IUU strategic outlook by the Coast Guard. So joining this discussion to my right are Admiral Carl Schultz. Admiral Carl Schultz is the 26th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. He started his position in June of 2018, and he oversees all global Coast Guard operations and personnel. He served in the Coast Guard for nearly 40 years and holds degrees from the University of Connecticut, Harvard School of Government, as well as Coast Guard Academy. To my left is Admiral Craig Fowler. Admiral Fowler oversees the U.S. Southern Command, one of 11 U.S. joint combatant commands with responsibility for operations in Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean. Admiral Fowler has served in the Navy for nearly 40 years as well, with numerous operational commands, and holds degrees in engineering and strategic planning. To my left is Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, and Deputy Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. From 2017 to 2019, he served as the Acting Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and the NOAA Administrator. Before these assignments, he served for 32 years in the U.S. Navy, completing his service in 2017 as the oceanographer of the Navy. In his current position, Admiral Gallaudet leads NOAA's blue economy activities that advance marine transportation, sustainable seafood, ocean exploration, and mapping. Admiral Gallaudet also holds a PhD in oceanography. And then, again, to my right, we have Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Dr. Benjamin Purser. Dr. Purser joined the State Department in 2018 in the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, and since then has also served as Chief Coordinator for Sanctions and Denuclearization, as well as the Senior Advisor for Competitive Strategy to the Undersecretary for Arms Control. Dr. Purser ran the Europe and Eurasia teams for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2015 to 2018 and entered public service after 9/11, in response to which he left a management position and became an intelligence officer in the United States Navy. Dr. Purser's PhD is in political science. I should note that we were supposed to be joined first by Jonathan Moore and then Melissa Kehoe from the Department of State, but neither could make it today, so Dr. Purser has kindly offered to be here in their stead. So thank you to this great panel for coming here, and particular thanks to Admiral Schultz for hosting us here for his commitment to these challenges. So Admiral, I'd like to start with you and to talk about this strategic outlook. I'm really excited about this. This has been a really tremendous document. I really want to congratulate you on it. Can you tell us a little bit about it and why now?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to thank Dr. Somweber for being here because, just as I got to know Whit here in recent weeks and months, I think the right guy to help us get our brains around this and talk into this space. I noticed, Craig, they surround us with a lot of doctors. I'm not sure if this is enough doctors around two sailors to keep us in the lifelines today, but it's not lost on us that they were separated by doctors. And I want to thank Craig, and I want to thank Tim, and I want to thank Benjamin for being here today. This is important. This is our first foray at launching a strategic outlook about illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And it's a big deal. As I've traveled around my 2 years in the job, a lot of focus with the Coast Guard on counter-narcotics, counter-piracy efforts. I was up at International Sea Power Symposium 2018, and as I've traveled other places, what people want to talk to me about, as a recognized global Coast Guard, is about IUU fishing. And this is an evolving threat, and there's a lot of national security implications. And it really has replaced focus on counter-narcotics. It's placed focus on piracy. This is about sovereign nations and about protecting their GDP, protecting their livelihood. And I think the Coast Guard, as a recognized, I lead the International Maritime Organization, U.S. delegation. I think we have the right bandwidth. We have the right recognition in the global maritime domain to bring a voice to this, and that's why we put ourselves. We don't have, if you know the Coast Guard, we are stretched pretty thin across domestic challenges and global challenges. So this isn't about Coast Guard being the fish cops across the globe. We don't have that capacity, but this is about synchronizing efforts, and it starts with enhanced domain awareness. It starts with thickening lines of partnership. I think what you see here, these are a couple key U.S. partners here that are going to bring this together. And it's bigger than catching a few boats with illegal tuna. This is really about, systemic violations of sovereign nation rights. It's about threatening sovereignty, economic security, a weakening of the global rules-based order. And that's why I think the Coast Guard had an opportunity here at this time to put some lines of effort together here and really get after a threat. IUU fishing threatens a host nation's ability to protect their stable resources. There's a food sustainment issue. When you look at 40% of the world derives its protein from the ocean, you think about global population growth, you think about those areas today where IUU fishing is most prevalent. It's in the Pacific Island region, the Oceania region. You look at east and west coast of Africa. You look here in Craig Fowler's area of responsibility, U.S. Southcom AOR, whether it's Peru, it's Chile, it's Argentina, it's Uruguay, it's Ecuador, which Craig will talk about. This is a global threat, and it is a maritime governance threat. And I think I made a statement my team scribbled down when they said, if not the Coast Guard taking a lead, then who? I really think we are optimally positioned to bring a voice, to bring clarity. There's some challenges. This is about domain awareness, and about 9-10 months ago, I introduced a concept here that my team started pointing about tech revolution. We are not the bleeding edge organization on the technology front, so we've really got to lean in. We've got to partner with others. There's models out there. This is whole of government. This is academia. This is NGOs. If we can synchronize those voices, those efforts, I think we can get out and get about an issue that truly is a national security issue for many states. And where do the coercive, antagonistic, worst violators go? They go to these small countries with very little organic capacity to enforce their own abilities. IUU fishing is done in the dark, secret places. There's a lack of, and I don't want to make this about a particular country, but if you look at the worst IUU violator and you look at the complexity and the flagging and you look at the opaqueness, there's some things where this is about shining a spotlight, illuminating behaviors. I think when you start to see the picture, then you can start to have conversations about how do you up your enforcement game across the global domain. So I couldn't be more excited to have this panel here today. We are very honored in the Coast Guard to be able to step into this. And again, This is a learning venture for us. We've been in the business. I think there's some successes. North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, working with the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Canadians, the Chinese, take high seas drift net fishing over the last quarter century. And essentially, it's not completely gone. There's a case periodically, but you think about those drift nets miles long that ravage the ocean, working collectively, collaboratively, made some changes in behaviors on a global scale. And I think there's a similar opportunities here. So let me constrain my comments to that and we'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Admiral, for those comments. I'm just going to pick up on a quick thread there from one point. I really want to emphasize something that I think you raised, which is this idea of partnerships and multilateralism, and how multilateralism is a real key element to combating this threat. But multilateralism is a key element of so many other things that we care about in terms of norms and governance around the world today. And I think what's really true more than folks realize is that fish is often the first thing in people's minds in many parts of the globe that face the biggest challenges. In developing states, developing coastal states, particularly in the tropics. And so we go there to talk about this, that, or the other, and then they say, well, what about the fish? Right? It's quite literally the corner of the realm in lots of places around the world. And can you speak just a moment to your thoughts about how this is really an important point for the U.S. to be able to be a good partner on?
Yeah, I think when we exist in this great power competition, national security strategy, national defense strategy, and you're talking about influence, I look at a region like the Pacific Island, Oceania. Those island nations, they do derive their GDP 50% plus from the sea, and they have very little enforcement, so they're vulnerable. And you say we offer an alternative. We, the Coast Guard, with DoD colleagues, I think what we bring is genuine human partnership. We've been a 150 plus year Coast Guard, Pacific-based Coast Guard. There's a capacity conversation. I got a new fast response cutter heading to Guam today, followed by 2 additional fast response cutters. You're going to see more of those vessels in those parts of the world. We've got the National Security Cutter Kimball just wrapped up a trip out there. Unfortunately, off of Fiji, couldn't take a port call, couldn't do some of those capacity, those partnership things, but I think we're going to look at taking some of our law enforcement detachments, potentially repurpose them as fisheries detachments. How do we do capacity building, but this is about like-minded partners linking up efforts and finding common space to get after threats that essentially, destabilize maritime governance and threaten the rules-based order. I mean, that's the real national security piece of this. Then it gets into the eaches about the competitive. I see the Coast Guard on this continuum in this competition domain. We got a lot of stake in that, whether it's fisheries law enforcement, counter narcotics, rules-based orders. That's what excites me, is that I think this is right in our wheelhouse to be a synchronizer of effort here.
Great. Well, on that note, Admiral Fowler, I'll turn to you now. Commandant talked about IU as a national security threat. How are you seeing this play out in your theater?
Well, I'd like to thank Admiral Schultz for inviting Department of Defense Southcom here today. A great partnership we have with the 6th branch of our armed forces, the Coast Guard, and the work that the Coast Guard does daily to defend this nation, both nearshore and offshore, is phenomenal, and they're doing that right now as we speak in our counter-transnational criminal organization, counter-narcotics office. I also want to recognize our partnership with State Department. We have a deputy commander at Southcom who's a full ambassador, Ambassador Gene Maines, former ambassador to El Salvador, and it really brings us together. It's in a practical way, it's whole of government, and we talk whole of government a lot, but we see it right here at work on this platform. And the same for my shipmate, friend, and former neighbor, Tim Gallaudet. So there's a lot of collaboration just evident here, and I want to thank everybody for that, and thanks for you taking on the challenge of moderating this. Read your work, and I align myself with Admiral Schultz's remark about the importance of the efforts you're doing in research and being involved with the think tanks in this. It's very important. This is a national security, national defense issue. Illegal fishing. When I speak with partner nation chiefs of defense, ministers of defense, security ministers that are coastal, and that's the vast majority of them, the Caribbean, the countries of Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Argentina, and others, this is in their top 3, if not the top, of their list of security concerns. It threatens their national security. We talk about diplomacy, information, military security being the small letter in that dime equation. Economics, this is economics, and it's threatening their livelihoods, and our partners' security is particularly in this neighborhood of ours here in the Western Hemisphere with its close proximity, is directly affects the Homeland Security of the United States. So in support of our interagency partners, we believe there's a real role for Southern Command defense here. I'll give you one recent example to illustrate the importance of this threat. So Ecuador, Chinese fishing fleet of over 300 vessels operating just at the edge of the exclusive economic zone for Ecuador off the Galapagos for weeks on end and daily for periods of in excess of 8 hours. A significant portion of this fleet turns off their automated information systems, AIS, which are required to transpond per international law. Why would that be? As a mariner with decades of experience, I can tell you the only time that happens in that kind of frequency and that length is to cover up illegal activity. And so how is that in compliance with international norms and standards, to your point about the erosion of those norms and standards and how that affects global stability, which is why this issue is so important. It directly is impacting this global competition. The National Defense Strategy gets it right. We are in global competition, with China being the biggest of those competitors, and we are being charged with urgency to get after that. Department of Defense, we play a key role in the intelligence gathering, the domain awareness that's necessary to understand what these threats are, whether it's a counter-narcotics threat, a terrorist threat, or a threat to a nation's sovereignty by illegal fishing. So there is a role for us to play working with our partners at this table and our partner nations who want to partner with us because we share values and we're like-minded in our belief in the rule of law and democracy.
Thank you for that comment. I am struck you brought up Ecuador. I think this has been something that's been in the news, obviously, lately. Folks have been talking a lot about the Galapagos Marine Reserve. Another place it plays out almost on an annual basis is the Southwest Atlantic, where you have a high seas fishery there as well. And I think in both cases you have a system where the network of ocean governance is already weak. The existing agreements that we have for managing those resources are thin to non-existent in both places. And where you have incursions, aggressive incursions from a foreign state like China, can really erode those norms. Are you seeing this rise up as something? Traditionally, we think of resource and counter criminal issues in Southcom being related to things like drug trafficking. How is IU elevating with response, or relative to something like counter narcotics, is your concern?
As I mentioned, it's in the top of the concerns of every nation state that we interface with. And absolutely, as Admiral Schultz illuminated, has risen to the top of the list. And we're focused intently on the transnational criminal organizations, $90 billion a year industry that's killing people right here in our hometowns and in our partner nation hometowns. The kind of detection and monitoring that we do to build domain awareness, the kind of work we do with our partners at Joint Interagency Task Force South, where we have 22 partner nations working in Key West, to understand the battle space. There's an overlap here where we can use that battle space understanding to feed our common understanding of the threats to national security this faces. And we would work that by, with, and through our partners who have this primary mission, as Admiral Schultz illuminated. Recently, as an example, we had one of our national security cutters that was under the tactical control of Joint Interagency Task Force South, then shift tactical control in a law enforcement mode, working for Admiral Schultz and District 11, do a joint patrol with the Ecuadorian Coast Guard off of Galapagos, and frankly validated the illegal actions that we have been reading about in the media. So we are working in this space appropriately with our partners.
Great, thank you. Admiral Gaudet. So I think as Congress has also recognized the strategic and security importance of this issue. Last year's National Defense Authorization Act included the Maritime Safe Act, which was the first time, I believe, that IU has been brought into defense authorization, and has some clear mandates for everybody at this table, but most particularly maybe NOAA. and you guys are the first chair of the new Interagency working group on IUU fishing. What do you hope to do to use that new body to drive action, and how might your partner agencies here be engaged with you on that?
Sure, Whit, thanks very much. And first off, let me commend you and thank you for facilitating this. I'm your biggest fan as a fellow PhD oceanographer, so you're definitely on your side. But I also want to thank Commandant Schultz for hosting us, and thank you for your leadership, sir. With your maritime commerce strategic outlook, with the Arctic strategic outlook, and with this, you have a trifecta of strategic thought and leadership. And so kudos to the Coast Guard for that. We're happy to be a partner with you, and you too as well, Craig, thank you. And we're looking for more ways to partner with Coast Guard, DoD, and of course, State Department. The Maritime Safe Act specifically is exactly what you said. It is a recognition that this is a national security priority, and actually it's a national priority. I've been at a dozen or so, just this year since the pandemic, White House National Security Council meetings where this was a big issue. We've had meetings on South China Sea, on Pacific Island countries, on Indonesia, and yesterday, global IUU fishing. And again, China was the main culprit and was in every one of these conversations. So countering those activities is a national priority. With respect to the Maritime Safe Act, we are co-chairing a working group with the Coast Guard and State Department. And right now, we've only been established since June. But this is a working group to get at IUU fishing globally. And the first thing we're working on, besides developing a 5-year plan, is to really get at information sharing. That's just critical. And I'm really glad to hear Admiral Fowler talk about documenting what China is doing in Ecuador's EEZ. We need to do more of that. And in fact, one kind of representative of that kind of activity, the State Department and NOAA were just basically joined the National Maritime Domain Awareness Executive Steering Council. And that's a pretty big move because that will help us better share information together. And also, we traditionally have been environmentally science focused, but now we're getting into the MDA world in a big way because it's going to support countering this kind of activity. And so there's a lot of things I could also address about technology development. Admiral Schultz and I went to the southern border of Texas about a year ago, and we looked at some of the aerial drone systems that he's contracting for to survey the border, and we're doing more of that. NOAA has released several strategies involving autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, cloud, and big data, and all of these are going to help us better identify what's happening so we can better counter it.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to that in a minute when we go to the group questions, because I think that issue of data sharing and linking maritime domain awareness better internally within the U.S. government and with our partners is one of the critical questions, if not the critical questions, on how we grapple with this challenge. But I'm going to put a little pin in that and turn to Dr. Purser for a minute and just give you a chance to talk from state's perspective. We've both admirals, all three admirals, have really stressed the importance of international partnerships. How is state approaching this challenge? How does the U.S. build the coalition necessary to make a difference? And where do we start? Are there regional efforts that you see as high priority areas? Are there particular existing coalitions that you want to build on? What's sort of the thing that jumps out in your mind as kind of a ripe opportunity, and where are some of the challenges?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. That's a great question. Just want to take a moment to thank you, Admiral, for being invited. It's an honor to be here. I'm no proper replacement for Jonathan or Melissa, but it's really great to be representing state professionally and personally. As a former sailor, it's always great to be able to coordinate across the interagency. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So state, we believe that IUU is a real problem. It's a national security threat, it's enshrined in law, and it's something that we believe and we practice. And we engage on it in 3 different ways. So first, we engage on it bilaterally with individual states. We address flag states, we address coastal states, port states, and then, of course, market states. We want to engage with all of these folks to try and promote responsibility and accountability to try and decrease IUU fishing from going into the water. Secondly, we do this in a multilateral engagement way. We try and improve the rules governing international fisheries. And a good example of this is how the U.S., how we led the negotiation that produced the Port State Measures Agreement. It's a very, very important agreement. I know we're going to talk more about it later. It would be great if China joined that agreement, but that's the type of multilateral engagement that we prioritize. And then third, of course, we engage inside regional fisheries management organizations, where we try and push for binding management measures, conservation measures, to try and make sure that everybody else is following the rules. U.S. producers follow the rules, so we just want to level the playing field so that nobody has, neither China nor anybody else, has an unfair trade advantage over U.S.
Thank you. You mentioned port states. Maybe I'll pick up on there real quick before turning to the other folks here. That's a really landmark agreement, and I think for folks who don't know, Port State Measures Agreement came into being in 2009 or so, and now has over 60 signatories. And it basically says that unless you are complying with certain standards as a fishing vessel, then you may not have access to ports in a country that's a signatory to the treaty. We've ratified it here in the States, and so have a number of our most important partners around the globe. However, it's facing a challenge now with regards to implementation. So we have folks out there, good partners who want to do more, but have trouble from a capacity perspective or maybe a political perspective for actually implementing the requirements of port states. And then beyond that, there are limits in the kind of transparency and information that port state implementation has access to. So I guess what I would say, maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Purser, is are there things that you see as needed steps for helping to accelerate port state implementation, not just getting more countries to sign on, but actual implementation of that important document?
No, thanks. That's a great question. And you're right. Joining is only the first step. Right? Robust implementation is extremely important. So that's why I'm honored to begin my answer by celebrating the ways that Coast Guard, NOAA, and the State Department work together to build capacity with our partners. We also work with like-minded countries, so it's not just that we across the United States government work together, it's that with like-minded foreign partners, we also try and build capacity. So that states who join, then they learn from these wonderful NOAA training modules, they learn how to better do this. So this robust implementation, a large part of that is building capacity, but a lot of that has to do with this maritime domain awareness, right? We want a continuity of monitoring, and so we strongly encourage everyone, both parties to the treaty as well as non-parties yet. We want everybody to share information so that from harvest to landing, we're all able to understand whether or not authorized vessels are delivering authorized catch, or unfortunately we're having problems with that.
Okay, great. So I think we've established that transparency is one of the best antidotes to IUU. As with so many things, shining light in the dark spaces helps us to see what's there and what's going on. We talked about port states as maybe a lever that we could pull to use that transparency. It's a regulatory lever. But first we need to have the information. We need to have the data that enables us to pull that lever, right? And so there's a couple different ways we can come at this question. I actually want to start internally. I'm going to put this to the group. So what are some of the barriers that we have within the U.S. government for effectively sharing information? And here I'm talking about, we can act in a couple of different ways, and maybe it's helpful to kind of break this up. We can act domestically, primarily as a market state. We're the largest seafood market state in the world, so we have tremendous influence over global seafood trade based on our behavior and our preferences. Right now, however, it's estimated that maybe 30% of the seafood that we import is caught as IUU catch. So we're clearly doing a poor job of that. Programs like Seafood Import Monitoring Program at NOAA help, but they're just a start. And I think one of the biggest barriers to making SIMP more effective, to bring in other laws and mandates, is understanding how we can use those tools or effectively pull those levers, and that requires data. And that requires data being shared from traditional sources, say trade manifests, other kinds of information that NOAA is collecting. But it perhaps requires classified information as well, information that maybe the Coast Guard or the Navy has at their hands. Tim, you mentioned a working group that NOAA is recently a part of, but are there other ways in which everybody here at this table can work better together to share information across lines of effort?
Tim, you want to take the first shot at that?
Sure. Yeah, you bet. And so ways to work better together and share data. There's several, actually. And what I like is there are currently things in place to do this. In fact, Commandant Schultz has a Blue Tech Center of Expertise at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a very new Coast Guard development. And we are partnering with Scripps and our Southwest Fisheries Science Center to provide some of the S&T infrastructure there to support that development. So being able to work together and have avenues like this, which is actually authorized in law. The law is called the Save Our Seas Act. Will help us do that, because that center jointly we are working on these things, either it be the platforms or the applications like machine learning and artificial intelligence, or the actual collection assets like autonomous systems. All of that activity is already happening at this Blue Tech Center, and I think we need more of those kind of entities to foster that collaborative advancement and leveraging of S&T, and so we can really use the data to our advantage.
Great, thanks. The rapid expansion of relatively cheap remote sensing technology is helping both the public and private sector shine a light on opaque regions through nonprofit programs, of course, like Global Fishing Watch. You use some of their imagery in your strategic outlook here, as well as any number of private enterprises that are engaging with countries around the globe. But these technologies are often reliant on AIS signals to some degree. What are your thoughts on the use of AIS on the high seas? Should we be seeking an expansion of AIS requirements for fishing vessels? How might we convince other countries to, like China, to stop turning off their AIS signals when they're near an EEZ or even when they're not? Maybe, Dr. Purser, I'll start with you down there to think about this. I often think that, as we talked about port states earlier about strengthening its implementation, that's obviously the priority, but linking AIS use to port states in some way is potentially a very powerful tool. If you want to have access to a port, you need to have had your AIS transceiver on. Thoughts from the state's perspective?
Just to begin, I think that NOAA is doing an excellent job with this program of implementing this. As a former intelligence officer, it's used to having access to all sorts of feeds, right, and finding ways to make sure that we have instead shared information on this. Again, to go back to that continuity of monitoring. So we encourage other states to participate and share this information. I mean, we want to increase the transparency really when it comes to all of this. And so when we can have access and licensing agreements, preferably when there's some sort of sharing of information, that's preferred, right? So we strongly encourage, again, members of the treaty, other states, like-minded partners. We want to encourage the sharing of information so that we're tracking from harvest to landing.
Okay, great.
I'd make a comment on this,
Sure,
this
please.
data and information sharing. It's so important. I've been saying that we're stuck in the 20th century. Sometimes I think we're in the 19th century. Even in here within the U.S. government, the barriers, a lot of them are policy or cultural to sharing. And then the technological solutions that are out there that we all have on our iPhones have not been implemented fast enough for all of us. And it's a disparate hodgepodge systems that inhibit our own ability to get after problem sets, and it's compounded when you bring in partners. And so we need to get after with a sense of urgency that this strategy implies, these barriers to sharing information, and a system of systems that works. And it shouldn't be a state, Coast Guard, NOAA, Navy, Southcom system. It's got to be a solid system that we can all plug into, and we're so far behind in this area. The United States Air Force has a concept I think is the best of that I have seen. This joint, it's called JADC2, and it's Joint All Domain Command and Control, and it's designed to be from unclass to class, and it's software based where you can plug in, and partners would have a place in this. And I'm all in, and I think we all should be all in a common system where we can see ourselves, and there's enough filters to protect the information that we need to protect. But most of what we're talking about is available if you have enough money to buy it on open source. And you've done research on that, Doctor, that indicates how that disadvantages small companies, small nations, at the expense of some other countries that maybe don't align themselves to international norms that we've talked about.
Both those are great examples, and thank you for that example from the Air Force. I think that is a model that we are lacking here in this space here in the States. Ironically enough, we support through the State Department, USAID, and other programs, and NOAA, a number of fusion centers around the globe, notably Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, where we're doing just this kind of thing with our partners. And yet we don't really have that capacity here at home, and it's a little bit frustrating and also mind-boggling. And so I think that's a great example and one to think further about.
And I think, real quick, just Friday we celebrated we acknowledged the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and what was walk that back, and it was stovepipes, it was information. we look at the counter-narcotics threat, JADF South is, 3 decades plus in its existence here, and it's the world's most integrated joint multi-agency center. We've got some models to learn from. I think we can put this on its own. Now we have artificial intelligence, we have big data analytics, the work that Tim's doing. I think we can kind of take a step function into this domain, and you say there are other examples in the globe. So what we've got to figure out is, where's the terror lines? AIS was created, been sanctioned by IMO as a ship avoidance system, but it's being recognized as vessel monitoring. I think that's where we bring a role at the table at IMO, other places, to say, what could this be? What are the consequences of that? Craig talked about transnational crime, a $90 billion business. This is about a $97, $98 billion industry, the fishing industry. And you think about a 27, 28 billion of that, north of 25, 30% is illegal activity. And we import 80% of our fish, and a third of it almost, as you said, is coming in illegal means. This is really about illuminating and defining it, and it is about data and understanding it. So we got to get that part right. But I think what we can do is, and you and I chat a little bit, it's, hey, we may not create a fusion center immediately, but how do you take a couple of coasties, a couple of NOAA folks, put them in existing centers, understand what's going on, and then you have a vision to say, based on what we've learned through the counterterrorism fight, what we've learned here in the counter-narcotics fight, how do we sort of step function forward, say, this is the kind of center we have to do, modeled on X, or maybe from a clean sheet of paper. But I think we can jump into this with a whole different level of clarity of thinking and purpose of action, and get this going pretty quicker domestically. Right now, it's sort of, that's a bit why we're here today. This is a space that just lacks some synchronization, and I think these partners up here, I think, are absolutely committed to that. And it's about thickening lines with a lot of other partnerships. We can get after this, I think, very purposefully on the information front.
It's great to hear that, and I think really cannot state enough how important it is to have leaders such as yourselves stating that so clearly in that priority of working within the U.S. government.
And I took a shot at this about our tech, but the Blue Technology Center, we're at Defense Innovation University. We got a few smart coasties in good places that I think can help us really quickly start to build out that team of teams here to get after this. Yeah.
So, turning back abroad. And maybe I'll make this kind of a two-parter. So we've talked about the need for partnerships and getting our own house in order on data, but then making that something that we can share with our partners abroad. Colin, are there regions, particular places that you see as highest priority, particularly for Coast Guard, as you start to develop this strategy or implement strategy and work on the partnership plan?
Yeah, absolutely, Doc. I alluded a little bit to that. I think for me, stepping on this, what are we doing today? We got the Oceania Maritime Security Initiative, OMSI. We put Coast Guard detachments on transiting naval ships there. It's a low capacity conversation, but as we put these new fast response cutters, as we're building out our fleet of national security cutters, I mentioned Kimball working through Oceania recently, you will see more Coast Guard presence in those parts of the world. So that Pacific Island country, Oceania region, that is a priority. The east and west coast of Africa, we have a program, African Maritime Law Enforcement Partnership. The BEAR just came back. BEAR was exercising a maritime bilateral agreement with the Cabo Verdeans, and they talk about protecting the resources. I look at the opaqueness of, Senegalese fishing boats that were really Chinese fishing boats and backroom deals, and I think enhanced presence here. We've been off the African continent with a Coast Guard cutter about every 6th or 7th year. We actually had a ship there back in 19. We had the BEAR up there a little unexpectedly this year. I hope to have a ship back up there in 21, no later in 22. But when we don't have a ship there, we've got deployable specialized forces folks riding allied partners, working with host country folks, helping them understand what it takes to protect their EEZ. We transferred some former Coast Guard cutters, a couple high endurance cutters, like we still operate in the Bering Sea. The Douglas Monroe just got back from patrol, but the Nigerians have that. The Thetis, our medium endurance cutter, partnered up with them. So we give them a platform, we bring them out, we train with them. I think the African continent, Pacific Island, and I think Craig's theater of operations, Latin America, here in the Western Hemisphere, in our neighborhood, feeling pressures, and you say to yourself, you don't stop paying attention to the home location here a little bit. We got pressures at the border, fueled by illicit narcotics. You start to think about food sustainment pressures in this hemisphere. I look at the impacts from COVID and the forecasted economic situation that Latin America is going to be dealing with next decade. It's pretty dire. And this issue with food sustainment and encroachment, antagonistic and coercive folks coming in and making checkbook deals, this is absolutely, those are the 4 regions in my mind that I think line up best for the Coast Guard. Now, obviously, we can be pulled to other thinking here, but that's kind of where mine starts, is those four critical regions.
Great.
Absolutely.
Well, turning now to your region then, Admiral Fowler. This is actually an audience question I thought was interesting. So within the Southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil have significant naval and Coast Guard forces, yet they are seeking assistance to help in addressing IUU, specifically the identification of dark targets as well as other fisheries-related issues. It seems to be an opening for an increased role for the intelligence community. How can combatant commanders overcome the challenges to information sharing that are based upon the archaic mindset that makes it difficult to share classified products which would significantly contribute to addressing IUU? So this is going over some of our ground, but I think specifically in your region, how are you seeing this play out a little bit? Are you working with those partners in that way?
The Southcom strategy, which is exactly aligned and linked to the National Defense Strategy, is all about building the capacity and building and strengthening our partnerships and developing new partners. And one of the principal ways we do that is through our security cooperation programs. And one of the principal elements of that is working at intelligence sharing programs, training, systems, the whole gamut. It plays out daily in real-world operations through Joint Interagency Task Force South. We are looking to expand that for all aspects of what those nations would call their homeland defense, because the proximity matters so much in this neighborhood. Distance matters, and we also have the proximity of our economic linkages. It's the second largest trading bloc in the world, this hemisphere, for the U.S. Take away China, and it is the largest trading partner. The values, the familia connections, and so it constitutes such a neighborhood that's so close to ours that what happens in Latin America, the Caribbean, has a disproportionate impact, positive or negative, here in Homeland. So Homeland Defense is the number one mission set for the National Defense Strategy. Understanding what's happening in the battle space, domain awareness, sharing intelligence, being able to communicate in a secure manner with partners and amongst ourselves is a top priority in that Homeland Defense mission. So it fits right in. We talked Ecuador, we can talk Argentina. They're fighting that same illegal fishing fight. And in fact, it's gone kinetic in Argentina, and there's a couple very, very poignant examples. 2016, when Argentine Coast Guard actually sunk a Chinese fishing vessel in their EEZ. So this is a threat to their nations that we partner with. And by the linkages of the neighborhood, it's a threat to the United States.
I think Craig, to Craig's point, this recent Ecuador, we had a national security cutter berth out there. Ecuadorians read the articles. There's 350 predominantly Chinese flag vessels sitting in the Galapagos Marine Reserve outside the EEZ border, but they don't have the ability to get there and see them. With some maritime patrol aircraft supported by the United States government with a national security cutter teamed up with an Ecuadorian, patrol vessel, 4 or 5 days out there. Now they're starting to get in the thick of it. A couple of those ships that were questionable behaviors, we said, hey, Ecuador, here's the folks that might be worth taking a look at. That's what we can bring to that. I'm not sure they could have found the fleet without the U.S. enabling that, the Southcom ability to enable them. That's what I think the Chileans are looking for. It's you say it's a naval station. It's a naval country, but it's a naval country in an economically challenged region right now. So this is enabling behavior that's clearly, I think, in our shared interest here in the hemisphere.
And our ability to share information securely with like-minded partners, it scales up. It scales up from a fishing threat to a counter-narcotics threat to a terror threat to the next global threat. And you look at some of the key choke points like Panama Canal, this is critical for the future defense of a free world.
We're doing similar things, helping like-minded partners in the hemisphere figure out how you deal with cyber. From a Coast Guard regulatory standpoint, you think about the 355 seaports, you think of Port of LALB, where 40% of the goods we buy in big box stores, the Costco's, the Macy's, wherever you get your stuff, all that stuff, 40% of America comes through LALB. We're working on our own regulatory role with cyber here. The Panamanians, they're asking, the Colombians, other nations. I think this is stuff we can export that clearly is in our wheelhouse of national interest as well. And this IUU fishing one falls right in line with it.
Great. So let's steal the elephant in the room. We've all just been talking about China quite a bit. We've been, through my program at CSS and a number of other programs, highlighting China's strategic overseas investments, infrastructure, and how that plays out. So particularly from my perspective, we've been focusing on how their explosive growth in distant water fishing has been matched with significant increase in overseas infrastructure investment through fish bases and other specific port investments. Now, whether or not we think of this investment as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, it certainly represents an important strategic investment. A really strong indication of China's interest economically, strategically, in key parts of the globe. So how are our folks here on the stage seeing this impact play out in your worlds? And what do you think is the best response? And again, it's going to differ a little bit from state to NOAA to Southcom to Coast Guard. And maybe I'll start with Admiral Gallaudet. Your recent IUU report clearly articulated concerns with China's behavior, but it stopped short of listing them formally as an IUU sponsoring nation, in part because of sort of technical limitations on the definition of IUU. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your perspective on China's role in IUU, and in particular perhaps their investments overseas.
I'd be glad to. And before I do, though, let me address one thing. And Emma Fowler mentioned, we need some policies to better facilitate working together. We actually do have some success stories. We have, for example, in May, the President signed an executive order to promote seafood competitiveness and economic growth, and it specifically lists a provision to combat IUU fishing. So I thought that's a success. That's a policy statement, and we're moving out to implement that executive order. But with China specifically, you're absolutely right. According to the current definition of IUU fishing, that report that we released, and it's a biannual report that's required by the High Seas Drift Net Fishing Moratorium Protection Act, it's a mouthful. We issued this biannual report where we document illegal fishing activity, and countries can respond, and we basically certify whether they're still doing it or not. And so there's some legal terminology implemented through rules and regulations that define IUU fishing. And when I saw that report, I was the acting administrator at the time, and we had listed some countries, and they didn't include China. I went crazy. I mean, because I knew everything that Admiral Fowler just talked about and heretofore in the open press. And so we got the team together, they explained the reasoning, and we said, well, we're going to add that section that at least document open source, reports about what's happening. And so we're now working with the White House to explore the extent to which that definition needs to be revised, and including in addition to forced labor during fishing activity. So that's going to give us, I think, a lot more to work with. But as you mentioned too, some of the other activities we're engaged in include the reinforcing our position as a preferred partner all across the region, in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. And that we think that's going to also help us out in terms of countering China's not only IUU activity, but other illicit and environmental degradations like in the South China Sea with their island building and things like that. So that's been part of a major effort for NOAA to go forward in with Pacific Island nations, for example. And as Admiral Schultz mentioned, these countries, for their economic livelihoods, they care about fish, they care about things like coral reefs for tourism, they care about removing marine debris. These are all programs we run at a national level. We're the national authority for these. And so we've really become a preferred partner, and that's motivated much of our engagement to continue that, to be that in that position counter to China.
Anybody else want to speak to China in particular?
I was just going to say, I think when you sort of look into the China role in this IUU domain, I think it's what's the size of their fleet? It's the distant water fleet, maybe north of 16,000 vessels. We have a fleet of a couple hundred in the United States. You think about backroom deals that lead short-term gains financially to a smaller, limited government nation, but long-term detriment to their fishery stocks. And there needs to be illumination. We mentioned earlier, the opaqueness of the flag states, the transfers. I mean, there's just this, you don't know what you don't know, but I think the trend line points that it's basically exploiting, weaker nations with limited governance that really rolls up into that national threat to that rules-based order again. This is about model maritime governance, it's about rules-based order, but you got to sort of see it first, and you got to understand it. And I think that's the opportunity before us when you talk about China or other violators. It's about sort of, what I've watched, and you do some reading on China, you got to be very specific about what is the bad behavior you're calling out. And then I think when you see that, a competing global power has to take a little bit of stock about how they comport themselves across the globe. But this fish that occurs, the fishing off of the African west coast, those fish aren't landing back in Africa. I think 2/3 plus of that fish goes back to China. So right there's, where the fish aren't landed and aren't accounted for, there's already a math problem there a little bit. It's probably a lot more fish being harvested than is being reported a bit. So it just plays to, corruption and lack of transparency. And that's why I think the China conversation as the biggest, known IU violator has to be a key part of this conversation. It's not a bashing China strategy, but it's about who are those, China, Taiwan, about 60% or so, I think, or about 40% of all the world, about 60 IU fishing. We're 6 in the size of countries here. There's a certain, the Russians say there's a certain quality and quantity here a little bit, and we've got to recognize that, and that's part of this conversation by default.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize, and Dr. Bush, I'll get to you in a moment, but we're emphasizing China for a few reasons, because they are the dominant actor, but they are not the only actor.
Right.
Including we have some partners and allies who are on the bad list here. But I think what's critical to understand is that China's influence is so great that to the extent that we can help shape their direction and to the extent to which we can help them recognize that they are better served by taking a different path, I think we're all better served. And I think globally, our partners and allies and others out there who are also bad actors in the space will have to be brought along. So I think it's right to focus on China just because of their dominance, but we should not forget that there are other actors in this space that are also not behaving as they should. Just one more comment before we go on to you, Dr. Purser. I want to call back to a conversation I've had with some colleagues around the office. And a quick divergence here to the 70s and the Helsinki Accords. Famous accords signed by President Carter, recognizing, among other things, the importance of international human rights as a key element of global discourse and global norms. Now, what's interesting, of course, is the Soviet Union signed those documents as well. And years later, many folks cited that signature and those accords as being really critical to some of the movements in Eastern Europe and elsewhere that helped to bring about the end of the Cold War. I think perhaps that sustainability, and particularly sustainability around marine resources, has a chance to play out as something like the human rights plank in the Helsinki Accords of the 70s, but for the 21st century. Recognizing that this is a theme that is critically important around the globe for many, many, many peoples. And it's one that we, the US, can act on in good faith, matching both reality with our rhetoric in ways that perhaps global competitors cannot. So I'll leave that thought there and go to Dr. Purser.
Thanks. No, that's a great thought. I mean, the long-term sustainability of fisheries is really important. Without it, you have food security crises, then you have security crises, and so it's an important point. Adam, those are great points about the predatory practices of the Chinese, because it's not just the size of the PRC flagged and PRC backed fleet; it's also the geographic spread of it. We think that it threatens the developing economies of coastal states. We think it could threaten the stability of some of these developing coastal states. And for a country that claims it has a zero tolerance policy, we believe that they need to be doing a lot more about fishing without a license or outside of a license. We need there to be an even playing field where it's not just like-minded states and our producers who are following the rules and trying to make sure that the fisheries themselves are sustainable so that generations of people can still fish from them and still can take sustenance from them, right? It's about making sure that we have an even playing field now. And so, yes, there are other bad actors, but the size and scope of China's predatory practices are particularly problematic.
And it's alive and well in the defense world here in this hemisphere. The extent to which China is pursuing access, presence, and influence across all elements of power is alarming, and the sense of urgency with which we have to get after it here in our neighborhood of the Western Hemisphere is something that drives us at Southcom every day. Just a couple quick examples. Why would it be in China's strategic interest to acquire a deep water port in Jamaica, in Dominican Republic, or El Salvador? Yet they are aggressively pursuing those options and with the same sorts of lack of adherence to the rule of law that we see in other parts of the world. Both sides of the Panama Canal, multiple port visits, safe city, smart city technology throughout the hemisphere that allows backdoors to Chinese intelligence, economic loans, resource, illegal mining, illegal logging, and the list goes on. In the defense world, it's gifts of equipment, and it's professional military education modeled after Leavenworth in Spanish. And it's increasing at a rate that makes no doubt where they consider their future access, presence, and influence right here in the neighborhood that we call home.
Well, I think that may actually be a good place to stop here. We're coming up on time. So I want to go ahead and thank everybody here. I want to thank Admiral Gaudet, Admiral Fowler, Admiral Schultz, Dr. Purser. Really appreciate you all coming here today, and really appreciate your leadership on this issue. I think that this is a huge step forward, the idea that we can begin to think about these really important issues in strategic terms is critical to being able to come together and solve them, getting over our own bureaucratic barriers here at home and barriers abroad with our partners. So thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.